My name is David Thompson. I'm 39 years old, and at this very moment I'm preparing for my Maghrib prayer, facing Mecca, as I do every single day for the past 5 years. But if you had known me 7 years ago, when I still wore the American Army uniform and carried an M4A1 through the devastated streets of Aleppo, you would never believe what I'm about to tell you. I was the guy who mocked religious soldiers, who despised any mention of God, and who had absolute certainty that all religions were crutches for weak minds. Today, as I write this account with tears in my eyes, I can't stop thinking about the 8-year-old Syrian boy who literally saved my soul. What Omar did for me amid the rubble of a cruel war was so powerful, so pure, that it forced me to question everything I believed in, or rather, everything I didn't believe in. And what happened on our last night together was so impossible, so miraculous, that it changed not just my faith, but my identity as a human being forever. Before diving into this story that still moves me deeply, I need to make a special request. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I want to know how many countries this testimony is reaching, because I believe that God, Allah, wants this story to reach hearts around the world. And if you've ever had an experience that challenged your beliefs, be brave and share it in the comments. Sometimes our testimony is exactly what someone needs to hear today. I grew up in a small town in rural Texas, son of James and Mary Thompson, both fervent Baptist pastors. Our house breathed religion, services 3 times a week, daily Bible studies, prayers before every meal. But from childhood, something inside me rejected all of that. I saw the hypocrisy of church members, gossiping in the hallways after preaching about love, discriminating against the poor while talking about charity. At 16, I declared to my parents that I didn't believe in God. The disappointment in their eyes still haunts me, but it was at 22 that my rejection of faith transformed into pure hatred. My parents were returning from a religious conference when a runaway truck hit their car head-on. They died instantly. At the funeral, the pastor said it was God's will, that they were in a better place. At that moment, something died inside me. If there was a God who allowed good people to die so brutally, then this God didn't deserve my worship. He deserved my contempt. I enlisted in the army 6 months later, not out of patriotism but out of anger. I needed a place to channel all that fury that was consuming me from within. During 15 years of military service, I participated in 3 Middle Eastern missions: Iraq, Afghanistan, and finally Syria. In each place, I saw soldiers praying before missions and felt disgusted. I saw local Muslims stopping their activities 5 times a day to pray and thought, what a pathetic waste of time. I was known in my unit as Thompson the Atheist, and I was proud of it. In March 2019, at 37 years old, I received what would be my last military mission, humanitarian operation in Aleppo, Syria. Officially, we were there to maintain peace and coordinate supply distribution to refugees. In practice, we knew it was a low-risk mission, a kind of early retirement for veterans like me. I had no idea that those 3 months in Syria would be my encounter with destiny. On the 14-hour military flight to the base, while other soldiers prayed or read the Bible, I studied intelligence reports and mentally planned how to fulfill my mission in the most efficient way possible. My mentality was typical of an arrogant American. We were bringing civilization to a backward country that needed our help. I saw Syrians as victims of their own religious ignorance. But there were 3 things I didn't expect to find in Aleppo, which would completely change my perspective. First, the devastation was much worse than any military report could describe. Entire cities reduced to rubble, entire families living in basements, children who knew no world other than war. Second, people's unshakable faith amid absolute chaos challenged all my atheistic logic. And third, well, the third point involves an 8-year-old boy named Omar, who was about to give me the greatest life lesson I've ever received. It was on the 3rd day of our mission, a Tuesday I'll never forget, that my life changed forever. I was doing a routine patrol in a recently bombed neighborhood when I heard a low cry, almost a whisper, coming from the rubble of a house that had been hit the night before. As an experienced soldier, my first instinct was to ignore it. Sounds of suffering were all too common in that region, but something about that cry made me stop. It was different. It wasn't despair. It was pure sadness. I followed the sound, walking carefully through the debris, and found a scene that still haunts me. A small boy, too thin to be 8 years old, was sitting next to the body of an elderly woman, probably his grandmother. She had been hit by shrapnel and was covered by a blood-stained white sheet. The boy wasn't crying loudly, just silent tears rolled down his dirty face as he held her hand. When he saw me, a fully armed American soldier, he was obviously terrified. But then, in a way I'll never understand, he said softly, "Assalamu alaikum," an Arabic greeting I didn't understand at the time. I didn't respond, just stood there, not knowing what to do. That's when he did something that left me completely confused. He wiped the tears from his face and smiled at me, a genuine, warm smile, even in that moment of absolute loss. How can a child smile at an armed stranger after losing the only family he had left? This question began to bother me more than it should have. Against all military protocols and using a justification I didn't understand myself, I decided to take Omar to our temporary base. I told my superiors he might have useful information about local movements, a blatant lie that came out of my mouth before I could think. In reality, I couldn't leave that child alone among the debris with his grandmother's body. Omar, as I discovered he was called through a local interpreter, didn't speak a word of English but had an incredible ability to communicate through gestures, facial expressions, and smiles that inexplicably touched something very deep in me. In the first days at the base, he slept in a corner of my makeshift quarters, always waking up before me to do something that intrigued me profoundly: his morning prayers. During the first 3 days observing Omar, I witnessed behaviors that challenged all my understanding about survival and human nature. Even with constant hunger, military rations were limited. He always shared his portion of food with me, insisting through gestures that I eat first. When nights got cold in the unheated quarters, he offered his only blanket when he saw me shivering, preferring to sleep in the cold rather than see me uncomfortable. And every morning, religiously, he turned toward Mecca and whispered prayers in Arabic with a devotion that bothered me deeply. Why did that bother me so much? Why did that orphaned child's faith make me so internally restless? The answer would come in a way I could never have imagined. On the 5th night after finding Omar, I was jolted awake by a deafening sequence of explosions echoing through the valleys near the base. The ground shook under our makeshift bunks, and through the cracked window, I could see orange flashes illuminating the dark horizon. Another bombardment devastating some residential neighborhood. As an experienced soldier, I immediately recognized the characteristic sound of heavy artillery projectiles hitting civilian structures. My military training automatically led me to assess possible threats to our position, but my first genuine thought was completely different. Where was Omar? I jumped out of bed wearing only combat pants and unlaced boots, running through the poorly lit corridors of the temporary base to the small space he had transformed into his personal refuge. What I found left me completely bewildered. Omar was awake, sitting in prayer position on his thin blanket, but showed not a trace of the terror any normal child would feel facing those sounds of destruction. His eyes were closed in deep concentration, his lips moved rapidly, whispering words in Arabic that I didn't understand, and his small hands were raised to the sky in silent but intense supplication. The scene was surreal. While bombs exploded just a few kilometers away, that 8-year-old boy seemed to be in direct communion with something greater than both of us. His posture radiated a serenity that violently contrasted with the external chaos. I stood at the entrance, hypnotized by the inexplicable peace that emanated from that small, fragile figure. When Omar finished his prayer by touching the ground with his forehead and whispering what I later discovered was Amin, he slowly turned in my direction. His eyes shone with a light I couldn't identify. It wasn't fear, it wasn't resignation. It was something like hope, absolute faith. It was then that he pronounced the words that would change my life forever. With a heavy accent but clear determination, he said the complete phrase in English he had learned during those days living with us: "Allah protects you too, David." It wasn't a casual statement or attempt at consolation. It was a declaration of unshakable faith, said with the certainty of someone who truly believed what they were saying. At that precise instant, something inside my chest simply collapsed. I felt as if an emotional dam I had built over decades finally gave way under unbearable pressure. Tears began to spring from my eyes, the first since that terrible day at the cemetery when we buried my parents 15 years earlier. But these weren't simple tears of sadness. It was deep, visceral crying that seemed to come from places in my soul I didn't even know existed. I cried for the corrosive anger I had carried like armor for so long, poisoning every relationship and every moment of possible happiness. I cried for the countless people I had hurt physically and emotionally during my military career, justifying every act of violence as patriotic duty. I cried for the crushing loneliness that had been consuming me internally for years, for the constant sensation of being disconnected from any real or meaningful purpose in life. I cried for the idealistic young man I had been before my parents' death, for the man I could have become if I hadn't chosen the path of bitterness and resentment. Omar observed my emotional breakdown for a few seconds, and then did something I would never expect from a traumatized child who had literally lost everything. Without hesitation, without fear of my reaction, he got up from his blanket and walked to where I was kneeling, sobbing like a lost child. His small, calloused hands, marked by hard street life, gently landed on my trembling shoulder. He said absolutely nothing, didn't try to calm me with words I wouldn't understand anyway. He simply remained there, offering his presence as a silent balm for my exposed pain. The most extraordinary thing was realizing that Omar also began to cry, not for my suffering, but probably processing his own recent loss. Silent tears ran down his face while he kept his protective hand on me, creating a human connection that completely transcended barriers of language, culture, religion, and age. For approximately 20 minutes, we remained in that position, me pouring out years of repressed pain, him offering unconditional comfort despite dealing with his own trauma. Outside, explosions continued echoing through the Syrian night, but inside that small makeshift space, something miraculous was happening. I was witnessing and experiencing unconditional love in its purest manifestation. It wasn't love based on self-interest, compatibility, or mutual benefit. It was love that existed simply because the human being in front of me had chosen to love, regardless of circumstances or differences between us. That night, under the brutal soundtrack of a war that had stolen Omar's childhood and brought me there as an instrument of a military machine, I finally understood that I had spent my entire adult life looking for something that was right in front of me. Proof that there is something sacred in this world, something that goes beyond logic, science, philosophical arguments. When I finally managed to control my crying, I looked at Omar and saw in his eyes a wisdom that men 3 times older rarely possess. He had found peace amid absolute chaos, hope despite devastating loss, love despite having every reason to hate the world, and the source of this supernatural strength was exactly what I had rejected, fought against, and ridiculed during my entire adult life: genuine faith in something greater than ourselves. Not blind or superstitious faith, but faith that manifested through concrete actions of love and compassion. At that moment, although I didn't know it yet, my journey toward Islam had officially begun. Not through theological arguments or external pressure, but through the living example of a child who had chosen to trust in Allah, even when all human logic suggested despair. In the following days, I began to observe Omar with completely different eyes. Each gesture of his seemed to carry wisdom that I, with all my military experience and American education, couldn't comprehend. When he found clean water, a scarce resource at the base, he always brought me the first cup, even though he was visibly thirsty. When other refugees arrived at our temporary base, he immediately shared his few belongings: a piece of soap, some dried fruits, even parts of his blanket. Most impressive was his prayer routine. 5 times a day, regardless of what was happening around him, Omar stopped everything and turned toward Mecca. But I discovered something that touched me deeply. Through the interpreter, I learned that he always included a special prayer for me. An atheist soldier who had initially frightened him, he asked Allah to protect my soul, to bring peace to my heart, to help me find my way. One day, gathering courage, I asked through the interpreter why he did all this, why he cared for me, why he shared everything he had, why he prayed for someone who didn't even believe in his God. Omar's answer, translated word for word, was like a punch to the stomach. Because Allah teaches us that we must love even our enemies. But David is not my enemy. He is my brother, who hasn't yet discovered that Allah loves him. When he discovers this, he will be the happiest man in the world. How could an 8-year-old child, who had literally lost everything, family, home, security, future, still talk about unconditional love? How could someone so young have spiritual wisdom that made me feel like a baby in terms of emotional maturity? The answer lay in something I had rejected and fought against all my life, but which now began to shine in my mind like a distant light. The days that followed revealed layers of Omar's character that continued to challenge everything I thought I knew about human nature. I watched him interact with other refugees, soldiers, even stray animals that wandered into our compound. His compassion was universal, He didn't discriminate based on nationality, religion, or even species. When a wounded dog limped into our base, Omar was the first to offer it water and the little food he had saved from his own meal. What struck me most was his reaction to the American soldiers who weren't as kind as they should have been. Some of my fellow servicemen treated the local population with barely concealed contempt, viewing them as burdens rather than human beings deserving of dignity. Omar witnessed several incidents where soldiers were unnecessarily harsh or dismissive towards Syrian civilians. Yet instead of developing resentment or fear, he seemed to understand that these men were also carrying their own pain and confusion. One evening, I watched through our makeshift window as Omar approached Sergeant Martinez, one of the more abrasive soldiers in our unit. Martinez had just finished yelling at an elderly Syrian man for getting too close to our supply depot. The old man had simply been looking for medicine for his sick wife. When Omar saw the elderly man walking away with his head down in shame, the boy quietly went to our medical supplies, took some basic pain medication, and ran after the man to give it to him. What happened next changed something in Martinez too. Omar returned to where the sergeant was standing and, through gestures and his few English words, tried to explain that the old man wasn't a threat. He was just a husband worried about his wife. Instead of getting angry at the boy's interference, Martinez stood there for a long moment, looking at Omar with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Later that night, I saw Martinez quietly leave additional medical supplies near the area where many civilians gathered. This was Omar's gift. He didn't preach or argue or try to convince anyone of anything. He simply lived his faith so authentically that it inspired others to examine their own hearts. Through him, I was witnessing what true religious practice looked like, not rules and rituals performed out of obligation, but love expressed through action, even when, especially when, that love required personal sacrifice. Secretly, away from the eyes of other soldiers who knew me as Thompson the Atheist, I began asking questions I never imagined I'd ask. Not to Omar, he was just a child, however wise, but to myself, to the universe, perhaps even to a God I didn't know if existed. If there really is no higher force, where did Omar's supernatural ability to love unconditionally amid suffering come from? If all religions were really primitive superstitions, why did Islamic faith give this orphaned child strength that I, with all my military training and higher education, couldn't find? I began studying Islam in secret, using the base computer during my night shifts. I read translations of the Quran, researched the life of Prophet Muhammad, discreetly talked with local Muslims who worked as interpreters and guides. Every page I read, every conversation I had, every verse I studied showed me a religion completely different from the distorted image I had formed through American media. The Islam I was discovering spoke about compassion, social justice, care for orphans, exactly the qualities I saw in Omar every day. It talked about the importance of helping those in need, about equality among all human beings, about each person's responsibility to be a reflection of divine love in the world. Slowly, very slowly, I began to realize that my war wasn't against God or against religion. It was against my own unresolved pain, against the trauma of losing my parents, against the loneliness that had been consuming me from within for years. During those late-night research sessions, I discovered aspects of Islamic teaching that directly contradicted everything I thought I knew about the religion. The Quran spoke extensively about protecting the innocent, caring for the poor, and treating all people with dignity regardless of their faith. I learned about the concept of jihad, not the violent interpretation I'd been fed by Western media, but the internal struggle to become a better person, to overcome one's own selfish desires in service of something greater. I read about the Prophet Muhammad's treatment of his enemies, how he forgave those who had persecuted him, how he protected those who had tried to kill him, how he insisted that even in war, civilians, trees, and places of worship must be protected. This was nothing like the caricature of Islam I had carried in my mind for so many years, but perhaps most importantly, I began to understand the 5 pillars of Islam not as burdensome obligations, but as a framework for living a life of purpose and connection. The daily prayers weren't just rituals, they were moments to step away from worldly concerns and remember what truly mattered. The charity wasn't just giving money, it was recognizing that everything we have is a trust, and we have a responsibility to share with those who have less. As I delved deeper into these teachings, I found myself comparing them to Omar's behavior. Every principle I read about, He lived naturally, without apparent effort. He embodied the Islamic ideal of being a servant of Allah, not in a subservient way, but in recognizing that true freedom comes from aligning oneself with divine will, which is ultimately about love, justice, and mercy. But the real transformation, the moment when everything would change definitively, was still to come. My mission in Syria was coming to an end. In 1 week, I would return to the United States, and Omar would be taken to an orphanage run by a local NGO. The reality of this separation hurt me more than I was willing to admit. That child had become more important to me than my own biological family ever was. On our last night together, Omar made a request through the interpreter who worked at the base. He wanted me to learn to do an Islamic prayer with him as a farewell gift. My first reaction was to refuse. I was an atheist, it didn't make sense. But when I saw the hopeful eyes of that child who had changed my life, I didn't have the heart to disappoint him. There I was, David Thompson, a 37-year-old American soldier who had spent his entire life mocking religion, kneeling beside an 8-year-old Syrian orphan boy, trying to repeat words in Arabic I could barely pronounce. Omar taught me patiently, Allahu Akbar, my God is great. Subhana Rabbiyal A'la, glorified be my Lord the Most High. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace be with you and Allah's blessings and mercy. When we finished the prayer, Omar placed his 2 small hands on mine and said something in Arabic that the interpreter translated with tears in his eyes. Thank you, my brother David. Now Allah knows your heart and knows that you are a good man. One day when you are ready, he will call you home. At that exact moment, something inexplicable happened. I felt a peace, a spiritual connection, a love that transcended any logic or scientific explanation. It was as if an invisible hand touched my soul, healing wounds I didn't even know existed. It wasn't an instantaneous conversion. It would still take months of study, reflection, and spiritual growth. But it was there, kneeling beside a Syrian child amid the rubble of a war, that Allah touched my heart and planted the first seed of true faith. The experience was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't emotional manipulation or psychological pressure. It was a moment of profound clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I could see reality for what it truly was. I understood, in a way that went beyond intellectual comprehension, that I had been fighting against something that had always been there, waiting patiently for me to stop running and come home. In the days that followed, as I prepared to leave Syria, I found myself changed in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The anger that had been my constant companion for so many years began to feel foreign, like clothes that no longer fit. The cynicism that had protected me from disappointment seemed suddenly unnecessary. For the first time in decades, I felt hope, not just for myself, but for the possibility that life had meaning, that suffering had purpose, that love was more than just chemical reactions in the brain. My dear brothers and sisters who are watching, I know this story may seem fantastical or exaggerated to some, but every word I've shared is the absolute truth about how my life was transformed. If this testimony has touched your heart in any way, if you felt that Allah, or God in whatever way you know Him, spoke to you through this story, please consider leaving a super thanks. I want to be completely transparent with you. Super thanks is a financial contribution that helps me continue producing and sharing real stories of transformation, faith, and hope. Every penny I receive is reinvested in research, production, and the mission to reach hearts that need to hear that change is possible, no matter how far from God you feel at this moment. Your contribution, however small, makes a real difference and motivates me to continue this work of love. More important than the amount is knowing that this story has impacted your life in a positive way. Today, 5 years after leaving Syria, I am a practicing Muslim and proud of it. I perform my 5 daily prayers facing Mecca, fast during the holy month of Ramadan, regularly give zakat, obligatory charity, and have found in Islamic faith the peace, purpose, and love I searched for my entire life. More important than my religious conversion was discovering that true faith doesn't come from eloquent sermons, sacred books, or theological arguments. It comes from simple gestures of unconditional love amid suffering. Omar taught me that Allah isn't just in mosques or in Quranic verses. He is in the hearts of those who choose to love when it would be easier to hate, who share when it would be more logical to hoard, who pray for enemies when it would be natural to desire revenge. If you're going through a difficult time, if you feel you've lost your faith or never had one, know that Allah sometimes sends angels disguised as orphaned children to show us the way back home. I don't know where Omar is today. The orphanage lost contact with him when he turned 12. but I know that wherever he is, he continues to be a reflection of divine love in the world, and I pray every day that Allah protects and blesses him, just as he prayed for me when I was just a lost soldier who needed to find his way. Write in the comments, have you ever had an Omar in your life? Someone who, through pure example, completely changed your perspective on faith, love, or purpose. Share your story. It might be exactly what someone needs to read today to not give up hope. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to know that transformation is possible. May Allah bless all of you, regardless of your current faith or beliefs. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be with all of you.